Hi everyone, David West here with another episode of Buck the System. Oh boy, the world has changed a whole lot since I put my last episode out. It's been very interesting watching it all unfold. Kind of exciting if you're a bit of a survivalist like me. And I've been trying to figure out how I was going to address this and what I was going to say about this. I started really thinking about making an episode last weekend when some of the first, like the shutdown of San Francisco was coming out. And then various states were starting to close down all the schools. And I was trying to figure out, what do I say about all of this? And now here we are a week later, and California has issued a statewide shelter-in-place mandate. And I suspect that other states, very possibly even Oregon, where I live, will soon follow suit. And I've given up on trying to write something out that I was going to rehearse and deliver very polished, or even reading something like that out as an open letter. I've decided I need to just talk about this because this is getting crazy and out of hand. Because I believe at this point that the real viral threat that we are under at this point is fear and people's terrible responses to fear. And I'm sure a lot of you are going to think that I'm a terrible person for what I'm about to say, but I want everyone to know that I have no intention to adhere to any sort of shelter-in-place rule that might come my way. If Oregon gives a mandated shelter-in-place, I am promising you right now, I will upload a video every day. Maybe sometimes it'll even be a live stream of me going out and actively ignoring that, be it to go hiking, to go mountain biking, to go do whatever, go on a walk downtown. I don't care. I think that these things need to be ignored, because at this point, I think it's becoming more and more clear every day that the economic collapse and the repercussions that this is going to have against small businesses and so many different workers, especially in the restaurant and service industry, is going to be more devastating than even a completely unchecked coronavirus outbreak ever could have been. I think that there are a lot of reasons to be very skeptical about this whole thing as a pandemic. I think there's a lot of reasons to think that the death rate is nowhere near as high as people are saying it is. I think there's a lot of reason to think that it won't infect nearly as many people as people are projecting in the worst case scenarios, or even the kind of middle of the road scenarios. And I just overall think that we're being very, very premature to say that this is clearly just some awful, awful pandemic that's going to wipe out massive numbers of people. But I'm not really going to talk about that too much here, because that's kind of a separate issue. What I want to talk about is how, even if the worst case scenarios hold true, even if 1.5 million or 2.5 million Americans die from this, none of the response that we're seeing from the government is justified. No amount of death justifies this kind of egregious abridgment of private property rights and just rights to basic freedom and autonomy. Now, like I said, I'm sure a lot of people listening right now think I'm a terrible, selfish, greedy person who just wants my life to go back to normal because I said that. And you really couldn't be more wrong. Like I said earlier, I am very much a survivalist, if you could not have guessed by the fact that I broadcast from a gun bunker. And when I say that I'm a survivalist, I really can't overstate that. One of my most formative memories as a child is the New Year's Day flood of 1997, where horrible flooding hit Northern California, where I grew up, very, very hard. At the time, my family and I lived in a little town called Sayad Valley, small town of about 350, an hour away from the nearest stoplight, an hour to an hour and a half away from any grocery store truly worth shopping at. And Sayad is right on the Klamath River. So when that flood hit, a lot of people that we knew were devastated by it. I knew people whose houses got flooded because they were too close to the river and the waters got so high it ran right through their house. And they lost tons of stuff, and there was tons of damage, and roads were closed. There was 10 or 11 feet or 12 feet or something of water over the highway in a lot of spots. So we were actually out of town when it hit and couldn't get back down there. We'd been at my grandparents' house up by Corvallis for Christmas. And Our house wasn't in any danger. We lived on a hill 200 or 300 feet in elevation above what the river is, so we were well out of the floodplain. But I remember we got stuck at my other grandparents' house, my dad's parents, in Wairika for a couple days because we couldn't get home. And so my mom and, at the time, my two little brothers, I had another one born later, my mom and my two little brothers and I stayed there while my dad actually traveled over the mountains. He met up with somebody, I forget who it was, and they went down river, like in their truck. They went over the mountains to go get down there to help people, even though our house wasn't in any kind of danger. And I always really wished that I could have gone with him. It seemed so exciting. I really wanted to see the disaster. I wanted to help out. And I mean, of course, now that I'm a dad and I have a 7-year-old myself, I realize it would have been just a liability and a hindrance taking a child down there. But I was always so disappointed that I ended up missing the biggest action of the flood. It seemed so exciting. And from that point on, I'm sure it had kind of already been there in my head, but from that point on, I actively wanted to survive a cataclysmic event. I actively started becoming a survivalist. It was only a year or so after that, February of 1998, it was actually on my 8th birthday, that Sayad Valley got the biggest snowfall I ever saw living there. I think we got probably 18 inches or 2 feet of snow over the course of a couple days. And of course, it's that kind of semi-coastal, real wet, low snow where it's very heavy. So it knocked out a bunch of trees. We had big old branches breaking out of trees around our property, and it made the power go out. I remember being 8 years old and being so excited that there was snow. I was bouncing off the walls at 5 in the morning. It woke up my mom, and she was like, "David, you got to go to bed." And then the power went out. And the power didn't just go out. It stayed out for 3 or 4 days. And I always loved power outages as a kid. We would get a lot of power outages that would last for several hours, and it was always really exciting to me. And I was always disappointed when the power came back on. And so this one, where it was on my birthday, and so I didn't end up having to go to school, and the power was out for 4 days. It was one of the most exciting things in my life. My mom was cooking on our wood stove. I really felt like we were living back in the 1800s or something, and I loved it. And again, it was one of those other kind of formative early memories that turned me into who I am today. Growing up way out in the middle of nowhere like that, my family always had lots of food on hand. We would stock up for months at a time on meat. We would buy, whole pigs from people. We would buy, massive quantities of beef, and we would have to have an outdoor freezer to store a lot of that in because we just couldn't fit it all in our house. And it's not even like we were preppers, but just because where we lived way out in the middle of nowhere, we had to be more self-reliant and self-sufficient than a lot of people do, and we kind of naturally had to stock up on food. So because of that, another one of my very early formative memories happened when I was maybe 4 years old. I might have even been 3. I don't know. But my mom woke me up in the middle of the night, and she said, David, come on, Dad's going to kill a bear. And she took me out on our back porch, and we watched my dad in slippers and underwear take his .243 and shoot and kill a bear that had been getting into our refrigerator. We had that happen all the time because we had an outdoor refrigerator. We would have bears break into it. It would get so bad that sometimes we'd be gone. We'd have to park a car right up against it, or else the bears could get into it. And if it wasn't a tall enough car, they would climb over the top of it and knock it off its foundation. We had it on some bricks or something, since it was just outside in a dirt carport. And we ended up losing a lot of meat sometimes because of that. That's a significant amount of money that you lose. Hundreds of dollars worth of meat. So my dad had to kill a bear quite a few times. So, as you can see, even from the time when I was 3 or 4 years old, I was already having it instilled in me that it is important to own guns, and it is important to be able to defend yourself and your family and your belongings and your food and your provisions. As a teenager, in my mid-teens, when I was 15, 16 years old, I started convincing my mom to let me go backpacking without any adult supervision, just me and, maybe one of my brothers or maybe some of my friends. We would just go out and go backpacking for 4 or 5 days at a time sometimes. And around that time, I bought this here M1 carbine from one of my Bible teachers in the parking lot of my high school. And that was my first kind of, I'd had some guns before that, but they were like 22s and hunting rifles. That was my first kind of more military/defense oriented rifle. And I loved it. I shot it as much as a poor 16-year-old could. And then a couple years after that, on my 18th birthday, I bought this AR-15. And mind you, this was in 2008. This was only like 4 years. I don't even think 4 years. I think it was like 3.5 years after the Clinton assault weapons ban had lifted. And AR-15s had only been legal again for a couple of years. And hardly anyone even knew what they were. I didn't know anyone that owned an AR-15. I was the only one because I was that much of a survivalist. I'd spent years and years at that point thinking about surviving a cataclysm. I had a bug-out bag ready as a teenager. I would, as much as I could, try to have at least a few days' worth of food packed up at all times in a backpack if I had to, get out of Dodge. And, then I joined the military. I became an adult, and here I am today, 10 or 12 years after that, pretty well prepared for anything that comes my way. So why am I telling you all of this? Well, guys, if I think that the panic and the economic issues that are going to arise from this whole coronavirus things and the unintended consequences of the government's response are going to be worse than the virus ever would, that means that I think that those things are more likely to cause the collapse of society than the actual virus is. And I'm not going to lie, there's a big part of me that wants the collapse of society. I would do very well if society collapsed. My family would do very well. So if I was being truly selfish, I wouldn't be telling you not to panic and to be skeptical of the things the government is telling you to do in response to this. I would either be encouraging you to go along with the government, or I would be just kind of, biding my time and waiting to see what happens. But I can't, in good conscience, do that. I feel like I need to warn people. I feel like, I need to be one of the few bellwethers who's willing to be out there warning people, hey guys, I know I look like a jerk right now, but everything the government is telling you to do and all these shutdowns and all these extreme measures to save lives are probably going to hurt a lot more people in the long run than this pandemic ever would have. So far, none of this has really affected my life at all, and frankly, I don't really see how it would. My kids are all homeschooled. My wife stays at home. I work from home. I have several awesome freelance video jobs lined up for the next month or two here that I'm already paid for and that will not be affected by this pandemic in any way, shape, or form. One of the other things that I do to make income on the side between my freelance video work is I do app-based food deliveries, which is something that I'm starting to find myself making a lot more at lately with all the restaurants closed for dine-in, and that even if there was a shelter-in-place ruling, I don't think it would be shut down because restaurants and stuff, I believe, would still be open for takeout in some places. So my opposition to what the government is doing and how they're handling this, it has nothing to do with wanting my life to go back to normal. Quite frankly, guys, 2020 is a great time to be David West. The world has been on the brink of ending for months. Prepping is now considered normal. My own weirdly specific brand of dark humor that revolves mostly around threatening to overthrow the government has gone completely mainstream. And every single 2020 presidential candidate is so unrelentingly awful that the next evolution in the Boogaloo joke might be just to make it real. So basically all the weird stuff I've been doing for the last 15 years is now completely normal. None of this is going to affect me at all. Frankly, I'm finding it kind of fun going around and LARPing as a post-apocalyptic survivor at this point. I mean, guys, I'm so obsessed with surviving the apocalypse that I even like the movie The Postman. Nobody likes The Postman. I mean, I've literally been driving around for days now thinking about what the biopic about my life is going to look like someday after I save Oregon from post-apocalyptic disaster.
Our civilization lies in ruin. Government does not exist. Technology has been erased. And everything man remembers is gone. But to a people who have lost their hope,
You are a dangerous man. I can see it in your eyes.
He will give them courage.
I have a feeling about you.
He will restore their memories of the past.
It's the individual that counts.
These people don't need dreams. They need help. Are you going to bring them that?
I want him bound. I want him dealt with.
He will unite them with the message of freedom.
There's gonna be peace!
All that is to say, if you think that I oppose things like the shelter-in-place mandate that's statewide in California because I'm selfish, no, you're retarded. I'm just really starting to get tired of all the people who are acting like those of us who are skeptical and who don't think that we should be having such a knee-jerk reaction that is destroying the economy and locking down businesses and screwing over people who might be living paycheck to paycheck or even day to day. I'm just so sick of you guys sanctimoniously acting like, oh, we're so bad for saying that, and you guys are so much more moral than we are. You're so much holier than we are. You're so much more compassionate and considerate than we are. Because guess what, guys? You're hurting people too. In fact, I would argue that you're hurting people a lot more directly than any of us are. It sounds harsh to say it, but communicable diseases are kind of just a part of life. At some point, we have to just return to normal. You can't just always be locked down. I mean, I see so many of you saying things like, oh, but if it saves lives, it's worth it. But is it? I mean, there's so many things that could save lives that I don't think you'd be in favor of. We could ban all private transportation, not even just in the name of preventing global warming, but because we want to prevent car accidents. And we could just go to using buses, which are more efficient and much less likely to kill people. That would save lives. But wouldn't you agree that would be an insane abridgment of individual freedom? Yeah, of course it would. I see lots of people saying things like, oh, well, if you really cared about preventing diseases, you would be banning fast food restaurants because they lead to so much heart disease. And you might counter that with, oh, yeah, well, sure, but that's your choice to eat fast food. This virus can affect people and it's not their choice to get infected. But again, let's go back to my private car scenario. When you get into your car, you could crash and kill somebody else. It's not like you're only going to hurt yourself if you crash. You could easily kill an uninvolved party. And you're kind of, to some degree, taking their life into your hands. So where's the acceptable level of death before we're just willing to abridge everybody's freedom? Personally, I say there isn't one. If you aren't actively endangering someone's life, no one can stop you from what you're doing. So, sure, you could pour toxic sludge in the river and poison your neighbor, and people would have every right to stop you because you are directly poisoning them. You're directly affecting them. But you can't just look at everybody and say, oh, well, you're contributing a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of pollution to the air via your cars, and it looks like that's leading to global warming. And if it is, that might have dire implications for people in the future. So we're just going to shut down your business and totally make you change the way you live your life because of all these maybes and mights. You can't do that. That's not how freedom works. And when you do that and act so sanctimonious and self-righteous about it, you're just forgetting about all the unintended consequences that might come along with your actions. So sure, maybe you're helping the environment in the future if you shut down some guy's trucking business because his truck was putting out too much pollution in your book. But maybe now he ends up killing himself because he doesn't have any money and he can't take care of his family and he's depressed. Or maybe his family just ends up suffering financial hardships, and now some of his children grow up to be criminals because they don't feel like they have a whole lot of other choice. There are all these unintended consequences that come along with people overstepping their bounds of what they have a right to do, and I'm not going to let any of you live it down. All of you who are acting like those of us, and we're probably the minority at this point, but there are a lot of us who are skeptical this is as bad as people say it is, but who also say that even if it is as bad as the worst models, even if millions of people are going to die, even if 2 million Americans will die in the next year from COVID-19, I don't believe that shutting everything down is justified. And again, I'm sure you think that sounds horrible, but Where's the line? I'm not saying that COVID-19 is exactly the same as the flu. So far, while I do think there's some reason to be skeptical about if it's really as bad as people are saying it does seem like it is several times more dangerous than the flu. But it's hardly a humanity-ending plague, and the flu does kill a lot of people. So while, of course, the disease is not just like the flu, why is our response to the flu not the same as this? If we could save 50,000 Americans from flu-related deaths every year, why shouldn't we lock everything down? Why shouldn't we have quarantines every year as soon as a flu outbreak starts spreading? Because the only real difference between the coronavirus and COVID-19 and the flu is a matter of degrees. Sure, this may well be a worse pandemic and a worse outbreak than even a relatively bad year of the flu is. But still, when you go out and about in the flu season, you could be spreading the flu and not know it. You could be spreading it to vulnerable people and not knowing it. And frankly, all of us have probably spread a disease that has killed somebody. Not necessarily directly from us to the person who died, but you spread it to somebody else and they spread it to somebody else. And eventually, somewhere in that chain of contagion spreading, somebody died. Are we just supposed to feel terrible about that? Are we just supposed to shut everything down because of that? Or is that just part of life in a fallen world? So I ask you, what is your justification for shutting everything down because of the threat of COVID-19? Are you going to argue that this is all justified to flatten the curve because if we don't, people who would otherwise survive will die, whereas with the flu, it's mostly just people who were probably going to die from it anyway who die and not people who could have been saved if there wasn't overwhelmed healthcare systems? I mean, you can make that argument. I don't think it's very logical, and I still don't see why that couldn't apply to any other communicable disease. But I don't even see anyone making that argument. I feel like in making that argument, I have thought more deeply about this than almost anyone out there screeching about flattening the curve and screeching about exponential growth and how all of that justifies what's going on right now. Because I really don't think that any of you are supporting these measures for any reason other than that you've been told to. And that's really weird to me because I see in so many other areas a lot of people who are now supporting this kind of thing and telling me that I'm selfish for not wanting to shelter in place if it comes down to that. They wouldn't support this same logic in other areas. How many libertarians like myself would say, you know what? I don't care if banning guns would eventually cut down on all homicides in America. It's not justified. You can't limit the freedom of individuals, peaceful individuals, because of the actions of other people. Why do we recognize that that is what someone who believes in freedom should say in that situation? But then in this situation, it's like, oh, well, this is different, so we should shut everything down. And yeah, of course we can overstep our bounds. Of course we can violate people's rights. It's a virus. This is justified now. Doesn't make any sense to me. The only difference between the two is a matter of degrees. In principle, there's not really any difference. What if this disease is here to stay? What if it becomes kind of like the flu where there's a COVID-19 season every single year? And maybe it's more deadly than the flu, and every single year we're looking at hundreds of thousands of deaths. Does that justify having quarantines and having all these new regulations and lockdowns in place to prevent that every year? Or at some point, will you guys just be like me and start accepting that as kind of just a part of life? I mean, up until just the last century or so, people kind of had to just accept that as a part of life. How long were people dealing with the bubonic plague? But they just had to continue going about their normal lives because you can't shut everything down for decades or centuries. How badly are you going to hurt people by just shutting everything down forever? How badly are these ridiculous stimulus ideas going around about giving everybody thousands of dollars going to hurt the world and hurt America? I mean, don't get me wrong. If the government wants to send me a $4,000 check, I'll just view it as getting some of the money they steal from me back and use it. But that doesn't mean it's a good idea. That doesn't mean there won't be huge unintended consequences from all of this. I mean, truly, how far do you go with this? The logic being used right now to justify the government's reaction to this is horrifying. I'm not an anti-vaxxer at all. I think vaccines are very useful and can be quite efficacious. I think they're a great invention. But frankly, I've never gotten a flu shot besides when I was in the Army and I had to. Am I going to be viewed as a monster now because I don't get my yearly flu shot and I might pass on the flu to somebody? Is this whole situation going to be used as a justification for mandatory vaccinations for everybody? Because I tell you what's going to turn me into an anti-vaxxer, and it's that. You cannot preemptively force people to do things like that just because they might theoretically in the future hurt someone. Not only are the people who are supporting the panic and supporting all the government's actions in addressing the panic hurting people in the long term because of all the economic consequences, but in the short term, if this really does turn into as bad of a pandemic as some people are predicting, tell me, how aren't you hurting people by panicking them? How aren't you aiding in overwhelming medical centers and hospitals when you're making everyone with a little bit of a cough and a sore throat go in there thinking they have COVID-19? Isn't that overwhelming the system? You guys seriously have to stop acting like you're the ones protecting people and we're the ones hurting people, because the reality is a whole lot more complicated than that. So I just really want those of you who think that people like me are being jerks to think about that. Because seriously, guys, I'm not saying all of this for my own benefit. I'm saying this because I think that a lot of you are blindly supporting just very authoritarian, fascist government policies that are going to hurt a lot of people. They're not going to hurt me, probably. For as extroverted as I am, I live a pretty quiet life at the moment. I don't have a ton of interaction outside of my immediate family. And when I do, it's either at church, which is currently canceled, or with my friends who are all 30-year-old men who are very fit and healthy and not really in any kind of danger from this. So none of this is affecting me, and I'm probably even going to make pretty good money during this whole national shutdown. So please, please, please just try to think a little bit more instead of just acquiescing to everything that the government says. Try to think about what your actions could be doing to people. Because diseases spread invisibly, for the most part, I really don't think that people are liable for the deaths of others if they go out at a time like this. If, heaven forbid, your mom or your grandma or your dad or whoever, some older person, some more at-risk person who you love ends up dying in all of this, you really can't blame that on me. And don't get me wrong, like, I'm fine with some precautions, voluntary ones, not ones mandated by the government. But yeah, if you work in a nursing home and you start feeling sick, you probably shouldn't go to work. You should probably call in. But that goes for any disease, not just COVID-19. Even if people like me are going out and maybe we are spreading the disease, part of life, guys, there's only so much you can do to prevent the spread of communicable diseases. You can't shut everything down. You can't preemptively take people's freedoms. You can't do what we're doing right now. What we're seeing right now is basically the overlap between communism and fascism on the Venn diagram. We're living right in that little hole in the middle. People are crapping all over private property rights. People are crapping all over individual liberty. People are out there trying to rat on people for price gouging, which is just nonsense. It's really disappointing to me to see how many people, even people who claim to be libertarians, support that kind of tyranny. You can't prove where a virus came from. Most of the time, you won't know who you got it from or where it came from originally. There's no one to really blame, and you can't just blame the world at large. So if, heaven forbid, someone that you love, someone who's vulnerable, or maybe even someone who isn't vulnerable, ends up dying of this, you really can't blame that on me and people like me who don't think that everyone should be shut down. But on the other hand, if people's businesses go under because the government shut them down, the government is directly culpable for that. You can blame the government for what they do, and you can blame the people who support their actions for what they do. That is why I always err on the side of freedom over security. Right now, a lot of you who would probably claim to value freedom more than security are valuing security above all. And the ironic thing is that when you do that, you very often end up losing both. On the bright side, though, if civilization ever actually does collapse and we find ourselves presented with the unique opportunity to build a better and freer tomorrow, so many people have now outed themselves as commies and fascists by ratting on price gougers and calling for statewide shutdowns that it's going to be real easy to know who needs to get the rope, if you know what I mean. One thing that really cracks me up about all the people acting like I would be a terrible person to violate Oregon's shelter-in-place laws, which are probably coming, it looks like they might be coming on Monday, is that there are tons of exceptions to them. A lot of industries will still be working, probably the app-based food delivery industry where I make a fair bit of money. People are still allowed to go to the grocery store. I'm pretty sure they're often still allowed to go to restaurants and do takeout. There's all these exceptions. And so you're going to tell me that when I find a way to be in violation of it and go, hiking or on a bike ride or downtown or whatever, some of those things are still allowed. I'll have to look at the laws and figure out how I can violate it. You're really going to tell me that those things I'd be doing where I'm probably not exposing anyone to anything makes me terrible, but doing all of the legal things that are still allowed doesn't? It doesn't make any sense. You guys are just going along with whatever the government says and supporting the most arbitrary, asinine policies I've ever heard of. Watching this whole thing unfold as a Christian has been very interesting because I can't help but think that a big factor in why so many people are so fearful and calling for such authoritarian measures and acting like any death from this would just be the worst thing in the world is because they have a very awful, bleak, hopeless worldview. And I don't just mean because someone who's a secularist might not believe in heaven. I'm not just saying that my worldview gives me more hope than yours because if I die of COVID-19, I'll go to heaven. Or if someone that I love dies of COVID-19, they'll go to heaven and I'll see them again someday. I'm actually talking more about something that frankly afflicts a lot of Christians too, and that is a serious lack of understanding of God's sovereignty and providence. Even tons of Christians seem to think that anything bad that happens is just out of God's control, or that Satan is winning, or they don't understand where is God in all of this. And the truth is that no matter what happens and no matter how bad it gets, God is always in control, completely and absolutely. And anything that he lets happen it's kind of part of his will. And he will use it for the benefit of those that love him. And ultimately, he has a plan. Nothing that happens, no matter how bad, no matter how dark, no matter how seemingly hopeless, is without meaning and without purpose. God always has a purpose for everything that happens. And that should give us a lot of comfort and assurance. We're not going to see what exactly God's purpose was for something like a pandemic right now. We will probably never fully understand it in this life, but just know that God does have a plan for it. He's not just asleep at the wheel. He knows exactly what he's doing. And he has a purpose for every single thing that happens. And that applies to everything that I've said in this video as well. Like when I'm here warning you not to enact these authoritarian measures and not to be so fearful, because if you do, all these bad things could happen. Guess what? If those bad things happen, God is still going to be in control, and those things will still be part of his plan. Of course, I hope that those aren't part of his plan. I hope that lots of people don't, die and get hurt and suffer because of this. But if they do, be it because God is judging us as a society for all of our sins, or because he has some other purpose for it, he will still be in control. And that should give us a whole lot of peace and assurance. I know that no matter what happens, I will do my best to not be afraid. Anyway, on a lighter note, now that my wife is back from her travels and I'm doing pretty well financially, given some jobs I've locked down, I'm going to have a little bit more time in the coming weeks to put together episodes, and I'm currently working on putting together a little stockpile of episodes to be releasing as this time goes on. So while you're quarantined in your house and binging Netflix shows, don't forget to watch me, because I'm going to have some good stuff coming for you. And in the next maybe a month or two here, I'm going to have some really cool projects that I'm being paid to make right now to release. And I think you guys are really going to like that. So anyway, I hope you found this interesting. I hope I wasn't rambling too much, because I'm pretty frustrated at the world and the way everyone's acting right now. And I just think that a lot of you who think that you're being good moral people are going to cause a lot of human suffering because of the policies that you're supporting and because of the social shame that you're trying to heap on people like me who, won't have any of it. And you know what, guys? Not everyone has the ability to just shelter in place. Some people really do need to work every day to make money. I've been there very often myself. Even lately, I've been there a lot myself. I'm not at the moment. I'm doing pretty well at the moment, and I have some things really lining up for me to where, I could work from home. But a lot of people can't. And please be more considerate of them. And one final note, because I've had several people contact me recently saying that they're worried about me, and you're going to get picked up by the Alphabet Boys for talking like this. Guys, don't be ridiculous. I hate the government, but I also think they're incompetent. I'm much more worried about the precedent that all these actions will set and the principles that people just aren't thinking about than I am about the actual threat of martial law. I just don't see true martial law happening on any kind of widespread scale at this point, because the government does not have the power and ability to institute nationwide martial law. It just doesn't. It could maybe do that in small areas. We saw something akin to true martial law, not even akin to, it really was just martial law after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. But that was one small area. They can't do it to the whole country. And when you act so afraid of that and afraid that I'm going to be balled up by the Alphabet Boys for saying stuff like this, you're giving the government a lot more power than they deserve. And you are succumbing to the fear virus just as badly as all these people who are panicking and justifying the government's response to the coronavirus. And I don't think that anyone is going to come after me for violating something as stupid as a state shelter-in-place law. And if they do, it'll be local cops coming to give me a fine or ticket or whatever, which I will fight and I will win. Someone needs to do it. God has blessed me with a pretty assertive personality, so I'm going to continue standing up for the rights of people, even if none of you will.